Dr. ALY Baumgartner. Thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup from your office in Kansas, USA. You are a paleobotanist as well as the Paleontology Collections Manager at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History, studying how fossil plants help us with our understanding of life on Earth and changes in our environment. We're going to be looking at some of the most amazing examples of plant evolution out there, proving that they are just as weird and diverse as animals. So how are you doing, ALY? I'm just looking at your last name, Baumgartner. It looks like it might have a planty sort of meaning behind it.
Yes, so I like to joke that this is an example of nominative determinism when your name influences what you do. So yes, my name literally means tree farmer. More accurately is orchard worker. But yeah, that's how I ended up with plants, I'm sure.
Well, before we dig deep into the world of paleobotany, let's just hear a little bit about your background. ALY, did you always have an interest in science and, in particular, ancient plant life?
So I like to joke that though I'm a paleobotanist now, I kind of took the long way here. So I have always been interested in science for as long as I can remember. My dad was actually my high school science teacher. So growing up, we would, wander around in the woods. I have like vivid memories of collecting insects. When I was very small, the first insect I ever collected was a praying mantis. I did not know it was called a praying mantis. I called it a praying mammoth. So I've always really enjoyed I've always really enjoyed science, but particularly I've always been interested in paleontology, honestly, for about as long as I can remember. I am from Michigan, so in the state of Michigan, our state fossil is a mastodon. So a type of proboscidean, a type of ancient mammoth. And so growing up, I was just really used to hearing about the fossils of the animals that used to live where I lived. And I just thought that was super cool. And so I wanted to be a paleontologist forever. When I was in kindergarten, I wrote this it was in first grade. I wrote this all about me thing, and it said, when I grow up, I want to be a paleontologist. But I wanted to be a vertebrate paleontologist. I wanted to study mammoths. That's what I thought that I wanted to do. I had studied plants and everything because I liked the whole environmental perspective of things, but I was specifically interested in mammoths. So in my undergrad, I specialized in paleo ecology and paleo environment, but I did 2 different internships in South Dakota working on fossil mammoths. That's what I thought I wanted to do. And then I started my master's, and when I got there, my master's advisor said, so you'll be working on fossil plants. And I was very taken aback. I was like, it's fine. A master's is only 2 years. I could deal with plants for that long. And then I realized that the questions that I was most specifically interested in paleontology were best answered with plants. So even though I still have a soft spot for vertebrates, and I have a lot of training in vertebrate paleontology, I realized that plants were the way to answer all the questions that I was really interested in. Because in undergrad, I had taken vertebrate paleontology classes, but I had taken also more paleobiology classes, so anything alive. I had also taken a whole lot of botany classes. I had taken these field courses in botany, so I was very comfortable with plants, more so I realized than many people are. And so that was part of the reason why when I got to my master's that my advisor was like, you're working on plants. It's because even though I hadn't focused on them, I wasn't afraid of them. And so when I finished my master's, I realized, okay, I'm committed. I am team plant all the way. I've realized what I'm interested in. And then so when I did my dissertation for my PhD, I went all out plants from the beginning. This is what I'm interested in. But then at the end of my PhD, I needed a job. And like I said, I have training in vertebrate paleontology, but also invertebrate paleontology, as well as paleobotany. So the Sternberg Museum needed a collections manager. It's like, hey, I could do anything. So I ended up here.
Allie, you are a paleobotanist, so I guess a good place to start is what exactly is a paleobotanist and what do they study?
All right, so in the most literal definition, we study ancient plants. Paleobotany, ancient plants. But that's unhelpful. That doesn't really describe what we do. So broadly speaking, there are two main types of paleobotanists, basically broken down into what you want from the plants that you're studying. So there are the more taxonomic, systematic paleobotanists. So they will look at plants and they will try to actually identify them, figure out who they are related to, so that we can understand the history of life in that way, understand these family connections and where these groups originated, when these groups originated, things like that. So that is one way of coming at paleobotany, and it's very important. That is not the flavor of paleobotany that I do, though. So the other half of us, I would say, are the ones of us who are less concerned with the identity of the plants. I don't need to know what species it is, but we can use plants more of as a vessel, as a time machine, for understanding the broader environment. So either the paleo environment, the paleoclimate, the paleoecology, where it doesn't necessarily matter the precise affinities of the plants themselves, but more broadly speaking, we can understand the bigger picture. So understand things about how CO2 has changed through time, how temperature has changed through time. So both of these parts of paleobotany are very important, and they are important to each other. They're complementary, but they are kind of two different ways of being a paleobotanist.
So you're kind of a plant time traveler.
Yes.
I think you've called yourself that before, haven't you?
Yes, it is one of my favorite ways to refer to myself. What I do, I am a time traveler. What I do is time traveling. I think it's a good way to really help people understand what I do, because the thing about time traveling is that you're using all of your senses, right? Like if you were to get in a time machine, go back in time, go forward in time, whatever. The difference between that and just seeing a picture or watching a movie is that all of your senses are engaged. And that's kind of what we're doing with this kind of paleobotany, is we are trying to engage as many parts of the environment as we can. We can make it three-dimensional understanding, a four-dimensional understanding, because we're going through time. And it's more than just, this was here. No, this was here, and this is who it lived with. This is what how warm it was, how cold it was, how rainy it was, how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere. Just trying to get a much more complete picture.
Okay, let's begin at the beginning, the origin of plants. How far back do plants go, and how do they evolve?
All right, so like most life on Earth, they had an aquatic origin. So they did not originate on land, but they got there pretty quickly. So as of now, our understanding is that there were at least some plants on land in the Ordovician, and we keep pushing when in the Ordovician further and further back. So it used to be that it was the late Ordovician, and now it's maybe it's actually the middle Ordovician. So the earliest plants were related to aquatic things that we would now probably call algae. We probably wouldn't actually identify the ancestors of early plants as plants. So when the plants came on land, they were most similar to bryophytes and ferns and liverworts and hornworts and those little things. So these are spore plants. They don't have seeds, and they are non-vascular plants. So they don't have basically don't have tubes in them to move water or nutrients, so they are very low to the ground. Some of the reconstructions I have seen of these early Ordovician and Silurian environments are basically moss swamps, because nothing was very tall and they were pretty restricted to wet environments. They weren't getting very far away from streams and lakes and things like that. They needed to be close to water.
It just seemed like moss and fern-like plants ruled the world for a long time.
Oh yeah, moss are the original life on Earth, like their life on land at least. Like, it's moss. You need to respect the mosses. But it didn't take long for plants to really come into their own. So you have the Ordovician and the Silurian is mostly mosses and the like. And then by the time you get to the Carboniferous, you have trees.
Yeah.
So they are mostly related to ferns, but you have trees. You would recognize it as a tree. You might not recognize a tree that looked like that. A lot of when I was taking paleobotany, my professor would always describe the Carboniferous forest as looking like a Dr. Seuss forest, because like the shape of the trees is completely different from what we're used to with gymnosperms and angiosperms today. The ferns aren't shaped like that. But because plants had all this time, they had the Ordovician, they had the Silurian, and then in the Carboniferous, by the time you get to the Carboniferous, like, plants have established themselves, and they basically terraformed the world in a way that made it habitable for animals. So plants aren't the only thing that are pumping out oxygen. So they take in CO2 for photosynthesis, and then they release oxygen as a byproduct. They're not the only ones doing it, but they are major players doing that. So you have this change to a very oxygen-rich atmosphere during the Carboniferous. And then in addition, one of the big arguments in actually paleopodology, so the study of fossil soils, is whether you can have soils without plants. Because plant roots and plant like bioturbation, moving of the soil with their roots and pulling nutrients out of it, altering the soil in that way, can you have that without plants? So this combination of literally changing the world, literally changing the environment with these more complex root systems, with the way that they interact with water and nutrients. Also trees, they're dropping leaves. That is reintroducing nutrients into the environment. There are radiations of fish during the Carboniferous because there are so many nutrients in freshwater environments because of these trees.
And I suppose it's a bit of a paradox, because we think you need soil, but soil, as far as I know, comes from degraded plants and leaves and things. But what were these trees sitting in, or these early ferns sitting in, before there was soil?
So if you think about before the ferns with the more complex root systems, you have mosses. And mosses don't really have much of a root system at all. If you think about mosses, they will happily grow on a rock. They don't really have any roots, so they're not they don't need soil per se. But over time, you have as you have these plants with more extensive roots, plants are really good at breaking down rocks. That's what they do, physically and chemically. So that's the change you see, like the depth, because basically, like, as plants are physically able and chemically able to alter the parent material, whatever the rock that they're on, and then you begin to form soils. So basically, you had moss on bare rock to tree ferns with actual recognizable soils, honestly, after not very long, geologically.
And just out of interest, if you were to time travel to, say, the Silurian or something, you wouldn't last very long without an oxygen, the right kind of oxygen to the breathing apparatus.
Right, exactly, because there wasn't really, we didn't really have life on land. It wasn't really habitable for animals on land. So yeah, you would need like full-on diving bell, diving suit. You're functionally going to an alien planet. If you time travel to land, before the Carboniferous, you are going to an alien world. It is not going to look like anything that any human alive is used to in any way. The Carboniferous is weird, but it's recognizable, right? Like there are insects, there are early like amniotes, there are animals that we would recognize, and the plants look, I don't know, vaguely plant-like, but in the Silurian and Ordovician, and especially if you went back to try to do
very
land
sci-fi, I'm imagining.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like being on the moon, right? Like, I mean, a little bit, there's water, maybe more like being on Mars. There's water, and there might be like little crusts of moss and stuff, but it's completely different from any world that we know now.
Am I right in saying that plants ruled the world longer than animals have?
Oh, yeah. Well, it depends on your definition of the world. If you mean like the planet, no, we've been here about the same amount of time.
Still.
Yes, but the plants got on land first.
I see. And were there any mass extinctions of plants? We think of mass extinctions of animals, but did plants have any or none at all?
Okay, so this is actually incredibly contentious in the paleobotany community.
Sorry.
Oh no, it's really fascinating because if you think of our understanding of geologic time and like the way that we group time periods, you have the Paleozoic, and the end of the Paleozoic was this terrible mass extinction, and then the end of the Mesozoic, again, you've got this terrible mass extinction. But our understanding of mass extinctions are based on actually primarily marine animal life. So we're talking primarily about marine invertebrates, particularly the older ones, the first couple. But plants, first of all, were not on land until sometime in the Ordovician. So anything going on before the end of the Cambrian, they were not on land.
Yeah.
But in general, plants just have so it depends on where you're looking. But yeah, in general, plants have a different relationship with the world than animals do. Because plants are photoautotrophs, so they are using light from the sun to make their own energy. Most animals are heterotrophs. They are taking in energy from something else. So that difference in energy source is one of the reasons that they are affected differently in terms of mass extinctions. So if you were to base the geologic timescale on plants instead of animals, it would look fundamentally different. And as far as we can tell, some people say there have never been a mass extinction of plants. Most people agree there have been at least one. But like that is fundamentally different than understanding of mass extinctions for animals.
Well, plants have evolved and diversified in many, many ways. Carnivorous plants have always been a fascination for people, feeding on insects and other creatures. There isn't a great fossil record to work from, though, but what do we know about the evolution of these various species? How did plants learn to eat bugs?
So everyone loves carnivorous plants. It's plants doing its best animal impression. So that's a really good question. And it's complicated. Like there are so many carnivorous plants. There are many more types than most people probably realize. The cool thing about it is carnivory has actually arisen in plants at least 9 times in 5 different orders of plants.
Gosh.
Right. So that means that this is not uncommon. Like it's not super common, but it's not uncommon. It keeps happening. And they keep doing it in kind of similar ways. One of the things that's really common is the fact that plants will repurpose enzymes or repurpose secretions to turn them into these things that allow them to absorb insects so they can eat them. Because this is
similar to what snakes did?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. So because this is not a real group. This is more of a shape. So not all carnivorous plants, they're not all related to each other. They don't share a common ancestor. So they've done this multiple times. So basically every different group has some sort of enzyme, has some sort of secretion, because a lot of plants have like either nectar in their flower or nectar in other places on the plant that they're able to kind of change in some sort of little way. But yeah, so we kind of think of carnivorous plants as being like, yes, this is a plant, it eats insects, there you go. But they are parts of their ecosystem, so it's actually more complicated than that. They are ecosystems unto themselves.
Wow.
So you have like insects that will steal insects that have been caught by like Venus flytraps out of the Venus flytrap. For pitcher plants, there are entire faunas that can live inside of these giant pitcher plants. So there are species of crabs that are known only from the inside of pitcher plants in, I think, Indonesia. These are complicated organisms that all did this independently, and have allowed for more innovations in animals to arise.
And is it true that some people call them murder plants?
I have called them murder plants. Well, it's funny. I think it's the International Society of Carnivorous Plants. I think that's who it is. They actually differentiate between carnivorous plants and murderous plants. So carnivorous plants are the ones that are killing insects for food. The murder plants are the ones that are closely related to carnivorous plants, but don't necessarily eat the insects that they kill. So they just kill the insects and then don't eat them. Those are strictly speaking the murder plants.
Well, people may not be aware that there are a few living fossil plants alive today. I'm thinking of the 9,000-year-old spruce tree located in Sweden, Old Chico, but also the Pando clonal colony in Utah, which is possibly close to, I think it's around about 14,000 years old. So what can you tell us about these specimens, and how can they help us understand the evolution of plants?
So they can actually help us in a variety of ways. So at a minimum, they could tell us how long these species have been around, right? So if you have a spruce tree, an individual spruce tree is 9,000 years old. Okay, cool. We know that at a minimum, this species has been around for 9,000 years. Same with the aspen clone Pando. That's 14,000 years old. Again, that's telling us, okay, at least 14,000 years old, like that is the age of this species. So we can use that as at a minimum to help us understand this. And then in addition, it helps us kind of understand the different ways of living, because you have to be tough. The thing about plants is they don't move. They're stuck wherever they were born is where they spend their entire lives. And so they can help you understand the environment and how that may or may not have changed, because the plant can't, if it gets too bad, the plant can't just get up and move. So we can understand it from that standpoint as well. It can actually help us understand like how things have changed. If you look at old individuals or relict individuals, so things that used to have a really widespread distribution but don't anymore, or you find species that are not where you would expect them. There is a canyon in Texas that has maple trees in it. They're called the Lost Maples because during the last glacial maximum, there were maples in Texas because it was much cooler. But once the glaciers receded, these maples got stuck in a canyon and couldn't get out. So all of these things together can kind of give us a more complicated picture of how things are. We can also look at their DNA and see how it may be different from younger individuals of the same species, so we can get a sense for how are these species changing genetically, and how can we look at how that's changed in the past and how that may continue to change in the future.
So getting back to this idea of a clonal colony, I mean, is it that the plant just clones itself over and over again and appears to be so many thousands of years old?
So the way that it works is that plants are not, how is this described to me? Plants are not obligate sexual reproducers. Plants can just reproduce asexually. They can just vegetatively sprout off a clone of themselves. So these are basically just, a way to think about it is just that the tree is basically just adding little bits of itself. So you could, if you dug back or explored back, you could probably figure out like what the original tree was. But they're all copies of themselves. And that's something that plants could do really easily, particularly plants that live in a little less enjoyable, I guess, environments. So like cacti. That's why, like succulents, that's why you can give cuttings of succulents to people and they can grow them. That is vegetative cloning. That is the plant cloning itself and making copies of itself, because there aren't others, there's its species around in order to pollinate and make seeds and reproduce that way.
So the tree in Sweden, El Chico, is that basically one clone of itself, as it were, as opposed to the Pando colony, which is lots of ones, which appear to be multiple?
So some trees are just really old. So the one in, these basically two trees that are coming at it from, they got old in two different ways. Either you can keep copying yourself so that if some parts die, you still got more, versus there are some, gymnosperms are particularly good at this. So think about like the bristlecone pines in North America. This is a spruce in Sweden. Gymnosperms are much longer lived than angiosperms. They are a very like slow and steady wins the race. So they're not doing it the same way. They got old two different ways. That the one in Sweden is just a tough old tree.
Well, I've interviewed quite a few evolutionary biologists on my channel, and more than a few have referenced phytoliths as an excellent way of determining the age of a fossil specimen. So can you describe for our audience exactly what phytoliths are and why they're so useful?
So phytoliths, the name literally means plant rocks. So they are bits of silica that are embedded in plants. So grasses in particular are famous for their phytoliths, and they have a variety of uses. Often, such as in grass, they are grazer deterrents. So if you are eating grass, it's gonna grind down your teeth. You can't do it regularly. That's why horses and things that graze will have really high crowned teeth so that they can just shear them down because the grass is fighting back. Yeah, so it's typically associated with grasslands and grazing and things like that, but it's actually much more useful because you can have phytoliths in a variety of different plants. They can help you actually figure out what plant you have, even if you only have, it's literally silica, it's sand, it's virtually indestructible. So you can use the shape of phytoliths to estimate what type of plant it is. You can sometimes use it to estimate canopy cover. The shape of these cells that these phytoliths are, they're part of a plant, the shape of them can sometimes tell you the amount of light that the leaf got, so you can get a sense if you have a very open canopy, so there's not a lot above your head, or if you have a closed canopy, there's a lot of stuff going on around above your head. Pollen and phytoliths are basically indestructible. So phytoliths, like I said, they're silica, they're sand, like it is one of the strongest materials. If you have ever taken a course in geology, you know that as rocks break down and weather through time, quartz, silica, it's one of the last things to break down. It's very, very tough. So that is why silica, these phytoliths are everywhere. In pollen is made of polysporinin. It is one of the strongest substances that we know of on Earth. So even if you don't have, say, a leaf impression, because that is going to be much more, maybe ephemeral. It's the kind of thing you need a special environment. You need a special situation in order to get that preserved. And that is easily destroyed. If the rock that had a leaf impression on it is destroyed, like, sorry, your leaf impression's gone. But you can get phytoliths and pollen in a lot of different contexts. It's really interesting because, like, I know people who study vertebrate paleontology, and you often do not find fossil leaves preserved with fossil vertebrates, but you'll often find phytoliths and pollen. So that's another way to get at that plant picture when you don't have, say, petrified wood or leaves preserved.
Well, we humans love to breed and manipulate plants to have in our homes or in our gardens. We've domesticated cereal grains such as corn. But no matter how much we try to change things, it seems that nature has already got the jump on us. Isn't that right?
Oh, yes. Humans have loved plants as long as we've been humans. And it's really fascinating to see that kind of play out both archaeologically but also genetically. And it's fascinating because humans love orchids. And humans have loved orchids basically as long as we've lived places with orchids. We see this relationship between humans and orchids in the archaeological record in, like, Greece and Rome, but also China. We love orchids. And so a lot of people think, and if you do kind of like preliminary research of orchid varieties online, it may seem like, oh yes, humans, we have selected all of these varieties and we have, crossbred things. And that's true, we've done that. But orchids have it like taken care of. There are almost 30,000 species of orchids on the planet. And for perspective, that is roughly the same number of species as bony fish. It is roughly twice the number of species as birds and about 4 times the number of species as mammals. So
wow, that's crazy.
There's so many orchids, right? So, like, we have hardly made a dent in the number of orchids just by, crossbreeding ones that we think are pretty. And part of the reason that orchids are so speciose is just because they are such specialists. So orchids tend to have very small ranges. They are not generalists. You can find them everywhere, but the species will have very small ranges. But yeah, like humans love orchids like vanilla, and not just looking at them, but like we think they taste great too. And this is something that humans do. We find plants, we like them, and we manipulate them. And we bring them with us all around the world. It's fascinating. You mentioned corn in the beginning. The wild type of a lot of plants is often indistinguishable from the thing that we eat. So teosinte, which is the wild type of corn, hardly has any kernels. It doesn't really look like corn. We have, humans have been manipulating corn for thousands of years to make it the easily edible thing that it is today. If you look at wild types of a lot of cereal grains, they are not nearly as easily grown as the things that we have domesticated and changed through time. But we have domesticated so many plants that people haven't really thought of, like watermelons. They used to have much more rind than the actual like edible flesh that you think of if you see a watermelon. If you look at like historical paintings of watermelons, they look nothing like what we're used to. But carrots weren't orange until fairly recently. They used to be a whole variety of colors, but we bred them to have more carotenoids in them, and so they're orange.
Interesting. Bananas, obviously, they weren't as beautiful,
Yes.
as you see them now.
Yes, exactly. Bananas, wild bananas have huge seeds.
Oh my goodness. And getting back to orchids, I know I've seen one, I think they call it the monkey face orchid, because it does have a kind of this look of a monkey's face on it. Now, surely that's humans did that.
I doubt it. the cool thing about orchids is that, like I mentioned, they have these really small species ranges. They tend to, you just don't have a lot of any particular species in general in the wild, compared to how many species there are. And so orchids have adapted in a couple different ways in order to maximize their reproductive potential. So they actually flower for a lot longer than a lot of other flowering plants, because the longer that you have a flower, the longer you might be pollinated. In addition, a lot of the reason we see a monkey face is because orchids tend to have bilaterally symmetrical flowers. And that's part of the reason why you could see a face in it. They tend to have bilaterally symmetrical flowers, and they tend to have a medial petal, so a large middle petal that's on the bottom in the middle. Again, so like that kind of gives it like a reminiscence of a monkey face. But the reason they're shaped like that is if there is a pollinator, the pollinator will sit on the petal. It's like a platform, so it makes it easier for them to collect the pollen. But in addition to that, those weird shapes also mean that if the plant is not pollinated, it can self-pollinate. And if the pollen can fall down into the flower, and it can self-pollinate.
But anyway, we humans, we see faces everywhere, so.
Yes, this is true. This is true.
Well, on this channel, we cover human evolution quite a bit. It's certainly one of my favorite topics in the sciences. But people may not know that you did your dissertation research in Kenya working with paleoanthropologists on Miocene apes and human evolution. So how does paleobotany fit into all of this?
So at the very beginning, I mentioned that I got to paleobotany the long way. And I actually left out a key detail that in undergrad, I majored in environmental science. I studied paleoecology. But I took nearly as many classes in biological anthropology. I have always found human evolution really interesting. So that was, again, one of my early loves. And so when I was looking into graduate programs, I saw that the person who became my dissertation advisor, he was looking at, he had a project looking at the relationship between paleoenvironment and paleoclimate using plants and early human evolution. And it's like, those are my two favorite things. So I contacted him, and exactly, it was everything I wanted. So when I was in Kenya, I was often the only paleobotanist, and I was often the only paleobotanist a lot of these anthropologists knew. And so I would kind of joke that what I was doing, I was the context, because what they were looking at were these just very minute details and counting the number of cusps on a tooth to see if this is the same species, or maybe, is this variation? And people were wanted to make these connections about the evolution of these Miocene apes. But you really can't understand what's going on evolutionarily if you don't understand the context, if you don't understand the world that these animals were living in, if you don't understand what the possible impacts on their lives were. So in order to really understand the mechanisms of evolution, the drivers of their evolution, you need to understand the climate, you need to understand the environment, you need to understand the ecology, how these things all play together. And as I mentioned, you often don't have fossil plants and fossil animals preserved together, so you have to get a little bit more creative in order to do that. And so because you cannot easily make these connections, and there are a whole lot more vertebrate paleontologists and biological anthropologists than there are paleobotanists, often people will try to use other ways of getting there. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with trying to use animals to get a sense of the environment. There are ways that you can do that. For example, if you reconstruct that an animal probably used brachiation, so they are swinging with their arms through the trees. Well, in order to do that, there's got to be something to swing from. So like you can use things like that to get a general idea, but by and large, the reconstructions that are done that way are very broad. You will reconstruct that it is an open environment or is it a closed environment. So there's nothing above your head, there's a canopy above your head, and that's broadly it. But the danger with that, with such a coarse level of detail, is that it can often lead to this really frustrating circular reasoning. So if you don't have plants to kind of confirm any of this, you often people would get into this cycle of, well, we know that primates live, or early primates, they lived in forests. Well, we found early primates, so they must live in forests. And we didn't necessarily have any other way of supporting that except for that's what we expected. And so anytime we saw a early primate, or early hominid, early Miocene ape, we would basically, oh, we have one, it must be a closed canopy. We have one, it must be a forest. And which has also led to a really strange understanding of the climate and the environment of the early Miocene in Africa. Like there has been, for years, there was this idea of the Pan-African forest. Basically that like through the Oligocene into the Miocene, you only had a forest. It was basically like wall-to-wall trees. Yeah. That was it. And it's much more nuanced than that. Because if you actually look at the different fossil floras and look at the reconstructions of their climate and their environment, you can see that, like Africa today, it was a mosaic. So you didn't have grasslands yet. It was too early for that. But you had more open environments, more closed environments. It wasn't just like wall-to-wall trees. And that was one of the things that we found with the research that we did in Western Kenya from the early Miocene, was that we looked at these different fossil localities that had closely associated plants and animals, so close enough in time that we were pretty comfortable generalizing between the two. And we found that we would have almost complete turnover of the plant community. Like very little similarity in the plant community. We had very different environments, very different climates in terms of precipitation, similar temperature, but very different amounts of precipitation. And most of the animal community would be entirely different, except for the primates. You would have the same species of Miocene apes in a open canopy ephemeral pond, so a pond that's going to dry out seasonally, as well as in a closed canopy rainforest environment. So instead of the circular reasoning that we had been using, that primates, that must mean forest, it's the opposite. We could live anywhere. That was what was actually driving us, that we were not restricted to these very small environments, that we were able to adapt and change and live in open or closed environments. We weren't limited to the forest, and that changes our understanding. Not being limited to that circular reasoning, seeing the nuance helps us get a better idea of, okay, what were the drivers then? If it wasn't, suddenly everything opened up when we had the grassland expansion in the Miocene.
Yeah, so that's why we persisted, I suppose, because we thought, here's a problem. Let's not just sit on our asses. Let's adapt to this and move on.
Exactly.
It's been great having you on the show, ALY. Paleobotany was always something that intrigued me, but that I knew very little about. It's a fantastic subject that tells us so much about our world and our place in it. I will leave links to your work and social media in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you once again, ALY, for coming on to Evolution Soup.
Thank you so much for having me. I am always happy to talk to people about fossil plants. I don't think they get nearly enough credit, so I am so happy to be here.